Good morning, brothers. Today we're going to speak about Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer, who was born in 1836 and died in 1870. Before I begin speaking about Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer, let me just bring in a few insights into the context, especially the political context of his life. King Ferdinand VII of Spain died in 1833. Now, he had a daughter, Isabel Elizabeth II, but he also had a brother. The throne, by right, belonged to his brother Charles, but he left the throne to his daughter Elizabeth II. She was only 3 years old. And you can imagine this caused tensions, and this is what has been called the Guerras Carlistas. Those who favored king, well, not king, but who wanted Charles to be the king, they favored him. And this explains to a significant extent why the reign of Isabel or Elizabeth II of Spain was a turbulent one, because there were a lot of revolts against them. And especially in her youngest years, when she didn't have the faculty to rule, which is called a regency, military authorities took the power. And eventually, even when she ascended to the throne and she began to reign in 1833, she helped herself, especially by the military branch. She had a very outspoken and she was very outspoken, so she had no reserves in calling her generals generales bonitos. So that's how she referred to them. And this is the rule of the generales bonitos, of the beautiful generals, according to her. And but however, the one she privileged the most was Luis González Bravo. He was the government minister for her. And ultimately, it was he who ran the politics. And this is an important name, Luis González Bravo, because he was a personal friend of our author today. Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer and Luis González Bravo were friends. After such a troubled time, the rule of Isabel II or Elizabeth II of Spain finally ended in 1868. She was in San Sebastián in the north of Spain, so it was very easy for her to go to exile and never come back to Spain. She went to exile, and of course this also caused trouble for Luis González Bravo. This was the Glorious Revolution, and just so you frame things within their context, it was also this revolution the occasion for Bismarck to upset Napoleon III of France, and that is what triggered the Franco-Prussian War, just to set a global outlook on history and politics of those times. Now, let's go to a little city, Seville. It's a city, but nevertheless, it's not like it's very significant in the outlook or the overview of all of Europe. And let's see what's happening there. By the mid-1800s, Romanticism, especially in Spain, actually in all of Europe, Romanticism was in its decline. They got tired of art for art's sake. That ideal of worshipping beauty and escaping to some different regions and some other exotic realms was overused, and eventually it wore out. And we can also see the rising of realism, especially in France. In this cultural context, we find a late romantic, Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer. But in spite of the fact that he is a late romantic, he becomes the deepest and the most intimate of all romantics. in Spain. He was born in Seville in 1836. When he was 5 years old, his father died. When he was 11 years old, 1847, his mother also died. He was, let's say, adopted. He went under the tutelage of his godmother. I think her name was Manuela Moncayo, who was a very avid reader. She was very prone to reading, especially Romanticism. Romanticism, I think, especially from Germans, from the German translations. It's also remarkable to state that Bécquer was also a gifted painter. He was a gifted painter, and so was his brother Valeriano. And they honed their painting skills, especially when they moved to the workshop of their uncle Joaquín Domínguez. Joaquín Domínguez in 1852. Nevertheless, Bécquer decided to pursue a literary career rather than a career as a painter. And with this goal in mind, he moved to Madrid when he was 18 years old. Now, things in our days have changed, of course, but maybe they haven't changed much. What do you think would be the fate of an 18-year-old man who moves from Seville to Madrid trying to make a living with his writing? Yeah, it was certainly tough. Those were very trying years, those were very difficult years, and he lived in dire poverty. He describes Madrid as dirty and ugly, like a skeleton. In addition, in 1858, he was diagnosed with the romantic disease, tuberculosis. He could recover, but you will see how this disease would return. In that same year, 1858, he met Julia Espí. She was the daughter of the organist and the director of the conservatory. And of course, you can find some resonance with the legend of the organist. Right. It is to her to whom Bécquer dedicated one of his most famous short poems, the one which speaks about her blue pupil and how her blue pupil was intended into his while she was asking what poetry was. And what was Bécquer's response? You are poetry. Things didn't go well with this romance, so he just backed down. And in 1860, he got a position working for the Direction of National Goods. Yeah, he worked for the government on the Directory of National Goods, but he was fired because he was drawing on the files. That same year, 1860, he met Casta Esteban. And the next year, they got married. In 1861. They had 2 children, and Bécquer dedicated himself to journalism, and that enabled him to make a living and to maintain his family. It was also when he published some of his first legends. Although he had already published a few legends before that, we can say that he begins publishing his legends in a more consistent way. It was also in this time when his brother came also to Madrid, and he was hailed, he was acclaimed as one of the greatest painters of Spain. By the way, even if there are great romantic painters in Spain, most of them have faded into obscurity because they are all overshadowed by Goya. Just like Mozart obscures most of his contemporaries, maybe with the only exception of Haydn, pretty much the same happens in Spanish Romanticism, in Spanish Romantic painting, because no matter how good they were, they all faded into obscurity, overshadowed by Goya. But let's not talk too much about painting, and let's continue with the life of Bécquer. I have mentioned that he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and the disease returned in 1863. It is also in the, yes?
What is the name of his brother?
Valeriano. His brother is Valeriano.
Thank you.
In 1863, his tuberculosis returned. And we find a very explicit mention of this, and we also find an interesting turn in his thought in the third letter that he wrote from his cell. There's a collection of, I think, 7 letters that are entitled Cartas desde mi celda, Letters from my cell, which he wrote in the monastery of Veruela. He was there trying to recover from his disease, and it didn't go that well for him. Nevertheless, he got a position working for El Contemporáneo, and he mentions explicitly this newspaper in the letters that he writes from his cell. The director of this journal was no less than Luis González Bravo. And with the assent of Luis González Bravo, he quit his position at El Contemporáneo, this newspaper, and he assumed the position of censor of novels. That was a high-ranking position within the government because it was up to Bécquer to decide which novels could be published and which had to be censored. This is an exception, because according to the regulations that Luis González Bravo had instilled in Spanish politics, they had to have some professional or academic degree. Bécquer didn't have any, but he made an exception for his friend, and that's how Bécquer got a well-paid job as censor of novels. Tensions within the military ranks were rising and escalating, and Narváez, one of the generals, overthrows, at least temporarily, González Bravo. Then González Bravo tries to come back, but things were getting troubled. And in 1868, the demise of Luis González Bravo, and with him of Elizabeth II, was definitive. This is an important event also for Bécquer's production, because he had asked Luis González Bravo to write the preface of his rhymes. So he had handed the entire manuscript to Luis González Bravo. It catches my attention how someone who was involved in politics, like González Bravo, was also an intellectual, right? And you can see that one thing does not conflict with the other. So, in this time, Bécquer handed the manuscript of his rhymes to Luis González Bravo, asking him to write the preface. While Luis González Bravo had the manuscript of Bécquer's rhymes, the revolution broke out, and his house, the house of Luis González Bravo, was sacked, and all of Bécquer's rhymes were destroyed. They disappeared. For obvious reasons, Bécquer escaped Madrid and he fled to Toledo. There, he rewrote all of his rhymes from his memory. And this was also a good occasion for Bécquer to leave Madrid, and leaving Madrid, he also left Casta. Yeah, she was pregnant with a third child, and it was dubious whose that child was. So the marriage was an unhappy one, and it was unraveling more and more. So Bécquer left Madrid for political reasons, but also for personal and for family reasons. He left Madrid for a few months, but in 1868, in late 1868, it was December 1868, he returns to Madrid and he reconciled with Casta. They patched things. He got a job as a journalist. But these were his last years, and Bécquer was already, well, actually, his last months. He was already infected, he was already very sick, and in addition, he also tended to his brother, who was also sick with tuberculosis, his brother Valeriano. They were very close. They were very close, and I think it was in September of 1870 that his brother Valeriano died. And Bécquer did not survive him long. At the most, it survived him like 3 months, and he died on the 22nd of December of 1870. It was only like 1 year after his death that his brothers collected his works and edited these works, and then they came up with a final publication. What's important about Bécquer's Romanticism? In him we find both the luminous and the dark side of Romanticism. We find that elated love and that charm and that quest for beauty, especially in his first rhymes that he dedicates with lots of enthusiasm and hopes to Julia Espí. In him, we also find that dark Romanticism that is filled with despair and despondency. Moreover, his friends who edited his works make it a lot more easy for us to read because they categorized his poetry into major sections. That section that speaks about beauty and about nature and about love, and that section that speaks about despondency, despair, and how crude and harsh reality is, and how he suffers from this disillusionment in his love life. We owe to Bécquer a renewal, a rebirth of Romanticism, because as I mentioned, in these times, Romanticism was in its decline. It had become stereotypical. It had become elated and grandiloquent, and while he's a great poet, José Espronceda, Bécquer did not like him. Bécquer did not like Esponceda's grandiloquence, and he realized that Heinrich Heinz, a German romantic, that his poetry was way more intimate. We owe to Bécquer the detachment. He breaks free from the molds of Italian poetry that had ruled over Spanish poetry since the Renaissance. Remember that when we spoke about the 1500s and the 1600s, what great Spanish writers were doing was to imitate Italian models. Those Italian models work very well for Italian poetry, but you had to force Spanish into those models, and it didn't always come that natural. With Bécquer, we find that poetry flows a lot more naturally, especially because he gets detached from the scheme of rhyme, of consonant rhyme. He knows that rhyming in Spanish is way more difficult than it is in other languages. And when you actually manage to rhyme something in Spanish, it ends up being clumsy, because you end up rhyming ado, 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 ada, 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 ando, 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 and all the endings that are the same. So Bécquer leaves that stereotypical mold aside, and he focuses on assonant rhyme. And you see that in Bécquer, consonant rhyme is practically non-existent. Above all, we find assonant rhyme, and that is how he rehabilitates the flexibility of the language, and he is able to explore the exotic, the occult, mixing it with great elements of Spanish folklore. At first, folklore from southern Spain, where he was originally from, but since his work and his relationship with Casta Esteban not only enabled him but constrained him to travel practically all around Spain, he inserts various elements of mystery and of legends that he gathers from different provinces or cities of Spain. Additionally, it's important to note how Bécquer brings arts together. Of course, he's a poet, he's a writer, but just try to remember how he describes the sounds of the organ in the cathedral. We almost get the impression that we are listening to the chords of the organ thanks to Bécquer's description. Think of how he describes the monastery in the Miserere. Again, he's describing some medieval art with words, but he almost presents that before our eyes. It's almost as if we could see it. He's a marvelous narrator, and sometimes he's so good that we disregard how good of a poet he is. And many of his, let's call it like this, many of his pictures are very well painted with words. The descriptions he makes of landscapes or of scenes, although he's only describing it with words, it's almost as if a painter was trying to describe what he had painted. So in Bécquer, we find a very profound and a very refined Romanticism. Once, in an exam, I asked, would you say that John Keats' Romanticism is the purest of all romantics? Most students responded yes. Of course, I was expecting also some justification for that answer. But one of the students answered, I don't think John Keats is the purest Romanticism. I think Bécquer's Romanticism is the purest Romanticism. Well, that's wrong. That answer is wrong. If you want to bring in another candidate to rival with John Keats, bring another candidate, but don't bring Bécquer. Why? Because Bécquer was no angel. His friends edited his works and edited his life to make him seem like the uncomprehended genius of Romanticism. And they presented him to us as an angelical figure, detached from all political agendas and worshipping beauty in that aesthetic realm. Historically, that is not the true Bécquer. Actually, that's not even how Bécquer envisioned himself. To begin with, his name was no Bécquer. His name was Domínguez Bastida. His last name was Domínguez Bastida, Gustavo Adolfo Domínguez Bastida. He had recourse to that grandfather's last name, meaning his father's second last name, Bécquer, because it was a lot more romantic. It was a Flemish last name, and that Flemish family had come to Spain, and they had been quite wealthy. They had belonged to the aristocracy to the point that in the cathedral of Seville, they had their portion for their tombs. So not every family could achieve that. But when Bécquer was born, that was only a title and that was only a memory. Nevertheless, he wanted to have that attached to his name. Second, how did Bécquer actually look like? If you Google Bécquer, the first thing that you're going to see is the painting his brother Valeriano made of him, dressed in some kind of medieval attire. And again, that was not Bécquer. He didn't look like that, and he didn't dress like that. If you look at the few surviving photographs of Bécquer, you will see that he looks a lot different. He was not like his brother painted him. He was not like his brother wanted him to be. He's not that romantic idol. Of course, he lived in biting poverty, right? And actually, no, that was only temporal. Yes, when he came to Madrid, he struggled and he had financial difficulties, but that lasted just for a short time. Eventually, he would get a good job. If we imagine Bécquer like that uncomprehended genius that struggles all his life with poverty, we are having a thwarted image of Bécquer. He had at least a middle-class job and sometimes a very well-paid job. Julia Sp, she didn't requite his love because she was after a way bigger fish. She had a bigger fish to fry. And actually, she was right. She ended up marrying the Minister of the Treasury of Spain. And to her, Bécquer seemed dirty and disheveled. One of the harshest things about Bécquer's life, how did he meet his future wife, Casta Esteban, who, by the way, she didn't honor her name? He met her through his doctor. His doctor for what? For STDs. No. The question is, how would this doctor, who was a doctor in STDs, who knew all the infections Bécquer was carrying with himself, have him marry his daughter? Why? Because there was no other better party for her, because of the dissolute life she lived. He was heavily involved in politics. Even if someone to present a Bécquer who was living in an ethereal realm detached from any earthly attachment, he was heavily involved with politics. When he writes the letters from the monastery, of course, he wanted to dedicate himself to solitude, and that's why he went to a monastery, right? No, this was not a monastery as we understand it. It was one of the properties that the government had embezzled from the church, and now they had transformed it into some kind of hotel, and there's where Bécquer lives. He doesn't live in a monastery, and as we understand it, and he doesn't live a monastic life style. And finally, we would like Bécquer to die from tuberculosis, right? Because with tuberculosis, you're a victim, yes? And that's the romantic disease. Well, most likely he didn't die of tuberculosis, he died of syphilis. On the other hand, after destroying Bécquer's life, let me now rehabilitate his poetry. At least let me rehabilitate his poetry. True, his Romanticism is very pure, especially after his third letter, when he was diagnosed with tuberculosis for the second time. I think after that, Bécquer is detached from any political agenda, and he dedicates himself to appreciating beauty and nature. If you read that third letter that he wrote, the third letter from his cell, you find someone who has a very profound appreciation of beauty and of nature and of Spanish folklore. And his glance is not that of a tourist. It's a profound vision that makes him resonate with even the humble flowers he encounters along the path. He's profoundly touched by the beauty and the folklore and the simplicity of Spanish life. He tries to flee to the realm of imagination and of dreams. And of course, many would see in Bécquer a psychanalyst ante litteram, meaning, although psychanalysis as a science would only flourish at least, let's say, half a century after Bécquer's death, nevertheless, he explores what psychanalysis would call the subconscious. And in the introduction to his Rhymes and Legends, he expresses this desire to bring out what is dormant in his psyche, and he flees to the realm of dreams. And those dreams demand to be crystallized with words. He also starts thinking about death, which was so proximate to him. And in the end, we find a figure of Bécquer who aligns with that ideal that his friends tried to create. If you want to say that in Bécquer we find a pure Romanticism, you will have to refer to Bécquer's last years, and it's a very short span of maybe 2 years. Before that, Bécquer was very involved with politics, and there were many other issues that prevent him from being regarded as the purest romantic who ever lived. However, it's also true that after he was diagnosed with tuberculosis for the second time, his Romanticism refined, it was purified. He distills that Romanticism and he explores those romantic themes with no attached agenda and with that beautiful ideal of just worshipping nature, worshipping beauty, and fleeing to a realm of aesthetics. Okay, brothers, thank you very much.